The marble courthouse fell silent as she walked to the stand. She wore no uniform, no medals, just a simple blazer that concealed the scars beneath. When she began to speak, the judge's smirk said everything. His mockery cut through the air as laughter rippled across the room. "Perhaps you could enlighten us on how someone like you served in elite units," he asked, gold-rimmed glasses catching the light. What happened next would shatter careers, expose corruption, and reveal the true cost of justice. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If this story resonates with you, consider subscribing for more untold stories of courage that change everything in an instant. The marble steps of the Arlington County Courthouse gleamed under the morning sun as Commander Zariah Blackwood climbed them, her footfalls nearly silent despite her practical low heels. She wore no uniform today, just a tailored navy blazer and black slacks that concealed the military bearing she couldn't fully suppress. The thin scar along her jawline caught the light as she turned to glance at the American flag fluttering above. Inside, Courtroom 4B, the air felt thick with expensive cologne and performative confidence. The gallery was unusually full for a military contractor fraud case, packed with journalists, legal interns, and suited executives from Paragon Defense Solutions. Their CEO, Darius Merritt, sat behind his legal team with the relaxed posture of someone who had never lost a government contract, let alone a court case. Judge Thaddeus Whitcroft adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses as he reviewed documents with theatrical thoroughness. At 62, his silver hair and distinguished profile had graced enough legal journals to fuel rumors of a Supreme Court nomination. His chambers had more photographs with politicians than with family. "The prosecution calls Commander Zariah Blackwood," announced Assistant U.S. Attorney Imani Washington. As Zariah took the stand, Whitcroft's eyebrow arched slightly. The oath was administered, and Washington began her questioning. "Ms. Blackwood, please explain your connection to the events of Operation Kingfisher on April 17, 2024. "I was the commanding officer for the Special Operations Unit deployed that night," Zariah replied, her voice steady, but quiet enough that several jurors leaned forward. "We were tasked with extracting a high-value intelligence asset from a compound in—" "Objection," interrupted Lowell Ashton, Paragon's lead counsel. "The witness is about to disclose classified information." "Your Honor," Washington countered, "the Pentagon has cleared specific operational details for this proceeding." Whitcroft waved his hand dismissively. "Overruled, but tread carefully, Ms. Washington." "Continue, witness." Zariah nodded. "Our primary and secondary communication systems failed simultaneously during insertion. Then our night vision equipment malfunctioned. The ballistic plates in our tactical vests showed catastrophic failure patterns inconsistent with manufacturer specifications when struck." "And you personally inspected this equipment?" Whitcroft interrupted, peering over his glasses. "Yes, Your Honor. Before and after deployment." "How convenient," Whitcroft muttered, just loud enough for the jury to hear. "And what qualifies you to evaluate military-grade equipment, Ms. Blackwood?" 15 years of special operations experience, sir. And it's Commander Blackwood." The judge's mouth quirked. "Commander? Of what, exactly?" The first snickers from the gallery were barely audible. Ashton approached the bench with a theatrical flourish. "Your Honor, we've reviewed the witness's submitted credentials claiming service with Special Forces, yet we find no record of such decorations or formal recognition." Whitcroft leaned back, making a show of flipping through papers. "Indeed. I see a rather imaginative service record here." He looked directly at Zariah. "Ms. Blackwood, this court has tremendous respect for our military, but appropriating valor you haven't earned is deeply troubling." The whispering in the gallery grew. Zariah's face remained impassive, but those closest could see her knuckles whiten as she gripped the edge of the witness stand. "Permission to continue with the technical evidence, Your Honor," Washington interjected. "Proceed, but let's stick to facts, not fantasy," Whitcroft replied, earning appreciative chuckles from Paragon's side of the courtroom. As Zariah described the equipment failures in precise technical terms, Ashton approached for cross-examination with the confidence of a man about to spring a trap. "Ms. Blackwood, forgive me, Commander, you claim your team infiltrated a heavily fortified compound using advanced tactical methods. Could you elaborate on these methods for the court?" We utilized a modified hey-ho jump with oxygen deprivation protocols and terrain masking approaches to avoid detection systems, Zaria replied evenly. Whitcroft removed his glasses dramatically. And which action film did you consult for this expertise, Miss Blackwood? The courtroom erupted in laughter. In the back row, a silver-haired man in a crisp military dress uniform shifted uncomfortably, his eyes never leaving Zaria. Tell me, Ms. Blackwood, Whitcroft continued, emphasizing the civilian address, if you were indeed this decorated special operator, why doesn't your public service record reflect these supposed achievements? Zaria's response was measured. Most of my operations remain classified, Your Honor. How remarkably convenient, Whitcroft replied, triggering another wave of laughter. I've reviewed hundreds of military testimonies and never encountered someone with such an invisible record of service. The gallery's atmosphere shifted from professional decorum to barely restrained amusement. A young law clerk behind Ashton whispered something that made his colleagues snicker. Perhaps, Whitcroft continued, you could enlighten us on how a woman of your stature managed to meet the physical requirements for units that, until very recently, were exclusively male. Washington shot to her feet. Objection. Irrelevant and inappropriate. I'm merely establishing the witness's credibility, Whitcroft replied smoothly. Overruled. Zaria inhaled slowly. I met the same standards as every other candidate, Your Honor. Of course you did, Whitcroft smiled, his tone dripping with disbelief. Tell me, were there many women in your, what did you call it, SEAL team? The defense table barely contained their amusement. Ashton approached again, producing a document with flourish. Ms. Blackwood, you claim to have led an operation in the Korengal Valley in 2021, yet our experts note that the tactical approaches you describe would have been physically impossible given the terrain and environmental conditions. Zaria's eyes narrowed slightly. The operation took place at coordinates 34.89 degrees north, 70.91 degrees east, on October 17th at 0200 hours. We utilized modified anchor points at the ridge's western face, bypassing the expected approach vectors. For a moment, Ashton hesitated, surprised by the precision of her response. The silver-haired officer in the back straightened almost imperceptibly. Whitcroft waved dismissively. Ms. Blackwood, this court doesn't have time for elaborate fantasies. Do you have any actual evidence that doesn't rely on your supposed heroic exploits? I've provided documentation regarding the equipment failures, Your Honor, Zaria replied. Yes, your personal assessments, Whitcroft sighed theatrically, without corroborating expertise. A juror coughed to disguise a laugh. Another didn't bother hiding her eye roll. Perhaps next, Whitcroft continued, drawing out his words for maximum effect. You'll tell us you single-handedly captured terrorist leaders while… The men waited in the helicopter. The courtroom erupted in undisguised laughter. Even Washington looked defeated, shuffling papers as if seeking an escape. In the momentary chaos, Zaria made eye contact with the silver-haired officer, who gave her a nearly imperceptible nod. She straightened her shoulders, the movement subtle but transformative. Your Honor, she said, her voice cutting through the laughter with quiet authority. I'd like to present additional evidence that has just been cleared for this proceeding. Whitcroft gestured grandly. By all means, Miss Blackwood, dazzle us with more tales of daring do. Zaria removed a small thumb drive from her pocket and handed it to the court officer. This contains recently declassified mission reports relevant to this case, authorized for disclosure as of 0600 hours this morning. As the officer connected the drive to the courtroom's display system, the silver-haired man in uniform stood and walked deliberately toward the front of the courtroom. The first document appeared on the courtroom screens, its header bearing the seal of Naval Special Warfare Command. Despite heavy redactions, one name remained clearly visible. Procurement Officer, Lieutenant Commander Prescott Whitcroft. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Judge Whitcroft's hand froze mid-air as he reached for his water glass. This document, Zaria explained calmly, shows the expedited approval process for Paragon's tactical communication systems, signed by Lieutenant Commander Prescott Whitcroft. Your son, Your Honor, bypassing 3 standard safety protocols. Before Whitcroft could respond, the silver-haired officer reached the gate separating the gallery from the court floor. Permission to approach, Your Honor, he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Who are you? Whitcroft demanded, his earlier confidence evaporating. Admiral Elijah Harrington, Director of Naval Special Warfare, Your Honor. He handed a sealed folder to the court officer. I'm here to provide Commander Blackwood's unredacted service record, which has been specifically declassified for these proceedings by direct order of the Secretary of Defense. The court officer delivered the folder to Whitcroft, whose hands trembled slightly as he opened it, his face drained of color. For the record, Admiral Harrington continued, Commander Zariah Blackwood served as leader of SEAL Team Echo for 7 years. She is the recipient of 2 Silver Stars, a Navy Cross, and 4 Purple Hearts. The details of 19 of her 26 major operations remain classified at the highest levels. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. On the screen, another document appeared, security footage showing Judge Whitcroft meeting with Darius Merritt and 2 other Paragon executives in a private dining room 6 weeks earlier. Your Honor, Zariah said quietly, Operation Kingfisher resulted in the deaths of 4 members of my team when their equipment failed. Among them was Lieutenant Farron Whitcroft, your nephew, who was serving his first deployment under my command. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. A journalist dropped her pen. Whitcroft's face contorted with a mixture of rage and panic. You have no right, he began. The final document, Zariah continued, her voice unwavering, is a financial disclosure showing your 16% ownership stake in Helios. Holdings, Paragon's parent company, acquired 3 months after your nephew's death, and 1 month before you were assigned this case. Admiral Harrington turned to face the gallery. Commander Blackwood was ordered not to disclose her full identity or her connection to this case during these proceedings, as part of an ongoing Justice Department investigation into defense procurement fraud. That gag order has been lifted as of this morning. 2 federal marshals entered the courtroom through a side door. Zariah stood, her posture shifting subtly into the unmistakable bearing of a commanding officer. Your Honor, while you were mocking my service, you were actively concealing evidence that your family's corruption led directly to American casualties. You weren't just presiding over this trial. You were covering up your own culpability. Admiral Harrington turned to Zariah and rendered a perfect salute. One by one, veterans scattered throughout the gallery rose and did the same. Judge Whitcroft, came the voice of the chief marshal. You're being removed from these proceedings pending an investigation into judicial misconduct. Please step down from the bench. Whitcroft's knuckles whitened around his gavel. This is preposterous. I am still the presiding judge in this courtroom. Not anymore, sir, the marshal replied, moving forward. By order of the chief judge of the Fourth Circuit, effective immediately. The defense attorneys from Paragon sat frozen, papers scattered before them like surrender flags. Darius Merritt had already slipped toward the exit, only to find federal agents waiting in the hallway. Washington rose from the prosecution table. Your Honor, in light of these revelations, the United States moves for an immediate mistrial and requests that the case be reassigned with expanded charges to include conspiracy and obstruction of justice. A tall woman in a charcoal suit entered from the side door. That won't be necessary, Counselor. She approached the front of the courtroom, badge in hand. Sonia Reeves, FBI. This case is now part of a federal grand jury investigation that has been underway for 14 months. We'll be taking custody of all evidence presented today. The spectators watched in stunned silence as Whitcroft was escorted from the bench, his judicial robe suddenly seeming like a costume rather than a symbol of authority. In the commotion, Zariah remained standing at the witness box, her expression betraying nothing of the vindication she must have felt. Only when Admiral Harrington approached did she allow herself a moment of visible emotion, a flicker of shared grief passing between them. Commander, he said quietly, Lieutenant Whitcroft would be proud. Thank you, sir, she replied, her voice steady despite the moisture gathering in her eyes. This was his fight, too. The courtroom had emptied considerably by the time Washington approached Zariah. Commander, I owe you an apology. I had no idea how deep this went. You weren't supposed to, Zariah replied. That was the point of the operation. Operation? Justice Department and Naval Intelligence have been tracking Paragon's activities for nearly 2 years. When 4 of my people died because of substandard equipment, it became personal, We needed someone Judge Whitcroft would underestimate completely. Washington shook her head in disbelief. So, your humiliation was planned? Tactical necessity, Zariah said with the faintest smile. If I've learned anything in 15 years of special operations, it's that people reveal themselves when they believe they're winning. 3 weeks later, the story had exploded across national media. Every major news outlet carried images of Whitcroft being escorted from the federal courthouse after his arraignment on multiple charges of corruption, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Paragon Defense Solutions had lost 80% of its stock value overnight, and 3 separate congressional committees had announced investigations into military procurement practices. Zariah stood at the window of her modest apartment overlooking the Potomac, watching the rain trace patterns down the glass. The knock at her door was expected, but unwelcome. 90 seconds, she called out. Precisely 90 seconds later, she opened the door to find Admiral Harrington and a civilian she recognized as the Secretary of the Navy's Chief of Staff. "Commander Blackwood," Harrington said formally. "May we come in?" She stepped aside, gesturing them toward the living room where 3 cups of coffee already waited. The civilian, Brenner, raised his eyebrows at the coffee. "Expecting us?" "The Secretary telegraphed this meeting yesterday," Zariah replied, taking a seat. When he mentioned the need for public reassurance, it was clear what would come next. Harrington smiled faintly. "Still reading between the lines, I see. It's what kept me alive, sir." Brenner cleared his throat. "Commander, the fallout from the Whitcroft case has created a serious crisis of confidence in our military procurement system. The President and Secretary believe a visible response is needed." "With all due respect," Zariah said, "I'm not interested in being paraded in front of cameras." "Not paraded," Harrington corrected. "Leading." He slid a folder across the coffee table. Inside was an official directive establishing a new oversight division within Naval Special Warfare Command, with Commander Zariah Blackwood named as its first director. "Congressional hearings begin next month," Brenner explained. "The Secretary would like you to testify about your experiences and recommendations for systemic reform." Zariah studied the document, her expression unreadable. "And if I say no, then we respect your decision," Harrington replied. "You've given enough. But consider this. The same system that failed your team is still in place. Right now, you have the attention and authority to change it." Later that evening, Zariah stood before the wall in her home office where 4 photographs hung in simple frames. Each showed a different member of her team from Operation Kingfisher, captured in informal moments during training or downtime. Lieutenant Farron Whitcroft was in the center, his young face serious as he cleaned his weapon. "What would you do?" she asked the silent images. The answer came not in words, but in memory. Farron's voice during his final mission briefing. "The point isn't just completing the mission, it's making sure there's a pathway for others to follow." The next morning, Zariah called Admiral Harrington with her answer. 6 weeks. Later, the hearing room of the Senate Armed Services Committee was packed beyond capacity. Cameras lined the back wall, and journalists filled every available seat. Senator Eleanor Richmond, the committee chair, gavelled the session to order. "The committee calls Commander Zariah Blackwood." The room fell silent as Zariah entered in her full dress uniform, ribbons and medals creating a tapestry of service across her chest. She moved with the fluid confidence of someone accustomed to high-pressure environments, taking her seat at the witness table with perfect posture. "Commander Blackwood," Richmond began, "thank you for your service and for your willingness to testify today. Would you please explain to the committee, in your own words, what transpired during Operation Kingfisher and in the subsequent legal proceedings?" For the next 40 minutes, Zariah detailed the equipment failures that had led to the deaths of 4 special operators, the investigation that revealed Paragon's deliberate quality compromises to increase profit margins, and Judge Whitcroft's systematic efforts to derail the case. The failure wasn't just in equipment, she concluded. It was in oversight. It was in accountability. It was in a system that prioritized money and connections over the lives of the men and women who serve. Senator James Holloway, a former Marine, leaned forward. "Commander, what would you recommend to prevent such failures in the future?" 3 specific reforms, Zariah replied without hesitation. First, an independent testing protocol for all tactical equipment conducted by operators who will actually use it in the field. Second, criminal liability for executives who knowingly approve substandard equipment for deployment. And third, a transparent procurement process with no exceptions for classified operations. Some would argue that such transparency could compromise operational security, noted Senator Chen. With respect, Senator, Zaria countered, we lost 4 operators because secrecy was used to hide corruption, not protect missions. There are ways to verify quality without revealing operational details. As the hearing continued, video feeds carried Zaria's testimony to military bases around the world. In barracks and command centers, service members watched a woman they'd never met fight for accountability with the same precision and determination she'd once applied to combat operations. By the session's end, the hashtag Blackwood Reforms was trending globally, and 3 different senators had already begun drafting legislation based on her recommendations. Outside the Capitol, reporters swarmed as Zaria emerged. "Commander, how does it feel to expose such high-level corruption?" "This isn't about feelings," she replied. "It's about ensuring that the men and women who risk everything for this country aren't betrayed by the very systems meant to support them." "What about Judge Whitcroft? Do you hold him personally responsible for the deaths of your team members?" Zaria paused, choosing her words carefully. "I hold accountable anyone who placed profit over the lives of American service members. The legal system will determine the extent of individual culpability." As the questions continued, a young woman in a Navy uniform watched from the edge of the crowd. When the press conference ended, she approached Zaria directly. "Commander Blackwood, I'm Ensign Talia Rivera. Lieutenant Whitcroft was my cousin. I just wanted to say thank you for what you're doing." Zaria's composed expression softened momentarily. "He spoke of you often, Ensign. Said you were the reason he joined." "That works both ways, ma'am," Rivera replied. "After what happened to Farron, I almost left the service. But then I saw you in that courtroom." Her voice steadied. "It reminded me why the uniform matters." They spoke quietly for several minutes before Zaria was ushered away by Admiral Harrington's aide. As they walked toward the waiting car, the aide handed her a tablet displaying breaking news. The House Judiciary Committee had just announced formal ethics investigations into 3 other federal judges with financial ties to defense contractors. "It's spreading," the aide remarked. "Good," Zaria replied simply. 4 months later, the Roosevelt Room in the White House was filled with military officials, legislators, and family members of the fallen SEAL team. President Callaway stood behind a podium adorned with the presidential seal, Zaria at his side in her dress uniform. "Today," the president announced, "I am signing into law the Military Procurement Transparency and Accountability Act, which will hereafter be known as the Blackwood Act. This legislation represents the most comprehensive reform of defense contracting in over 50 years." He turned to Zaria. "Commander Blackwood didn't just expose corruption. She provided the framework to prevent it from happening again. Her courage both on the battlefield and in our institutions of justice exemplifies the highest traditions of American service." The president lifted the ceremonial pen and signed the legislation into law. Cameras flashed as he handed the pen to Zaria, who accepted it with a formal nod. "Would you like to say a few words, Commander?" he asked. Zaria approached the podium, her gaze finding the families of her fallen team members in the audience. "This legislation bears my name, but it belongs to Lieutenant Farron Whitcroft, Chief Petty Officer Demir Aksoy, Petty Officer Rowan Hernandez, and Petty Officer Imogen Nkosi. They paid the ultimate price for a broken system. Their legacy is that no other service member will face the same betrayal." After the ceremony, Zaria found herself surrounded by the families of her team. Chief Aksoy's mother pressed something into her hand, a small silver pendant shaped like a compass. "He carried this on every mission," she said in accented English. "Now you carry it forward." Zaria closed her fingers around it, the metal warm against her palm. "Thank you." Later that evening, as the sunset painted the National Mall in shades of amber and gold, Zaria walked alone toward the Navy Memorial. She'd removed her dress jacket, though her posture remained military straight as she navigated the evening crowds. A voice called her name, and she turned to find Washington, the prosecutor from the original case, approaching with a folder tucked under her arm. "I thought I might find you here," Washington said. "Old habits?" I come here before and after every deployment, Zaraya admitted. Seems fitting today, too. They walked together in comfortable silence before Washington spoke again. The Whitcroft sentencing is tomorrow. 20 years with no possibility of parole for the judge, 15 for his son. Paragon's CEO got 12. Justice served, Zaria replied, though her tone suggested she found little satisfaction in it. There's something else, Washington said, opening the folder. Farron Whitcroft's personal effects were finally released from evidence. This was in his journal. She handed Zaria a photograph, dog-eared and creased from being carried in a pocket. It showed Zaria kneeling beside a much younger Farron during training, pointing toward a distant target, her expression focused and encouraging. On the back, in neat handwriting, "First day with Commander Blackwood. She sees more in us than we see in ourselves." Zaria stared at the image for a long moment, then carefully returned it to Washington. His family should have this. They asked that you keep it. Said he would have wanted you to have something to remember him by. The two women continued walking until they reached the central pool of the memorial. Washington checked her watch. I should go. Early court tomorrow. Of course, Zaria nodded. And thank you. Left alone, Zaria stood before the bronze relief depicting Navy service members throughout American history. As twilight deepened around her, other visitors to the memorial gradually dispersed until only a lone figure remained, watching from a respectful distance. Admiral Harrington approached slowly, allowing Zaria time to recognize his presence. I thought I'd find you here, Commander. Am I that predictable, sir? Reliable, he corrected. There's a difference. They stood side by side, looking at the memorial's central inscription. Any man who may be asked in this century what he did to make his life worthwhile can respond with a good deal of pride and satisfaction. I served in the United States Navy. The Oversight Division is fully staffed, Harrington said after a while. Your recommendations for personnel were all approved. Good people, Zaria replied. They'll do the job right. And you? Have you considered my offer? 3 days earlier, Harrington had approached her with a proposal. Promotion to captain and command of a new special operations task force focused on high-risk intelligence. Gathering, I have, she said. And I'm declining. If Harrington was surprised, he didn't show it. May I ask why? Zaria turned to face him directly. Because there's still work to be done here. The Blackwood Act is just the beginning. Implementation, oversight, training, that's where real change happens. I didn't fight this hard to walk away before the job is finished. The next morning, a cool autumn breeze swept across Arlington National Cemetery as Zaria stood before 4 new headstones, each bearing the name of a team member lost during Operation Kingfisher. She wore civilian clothes, dark jeans, and a simple black coat, but carried herself with unmistakable military bearing. One by one, she knelt before each grave, placing a small stone at the base of each headstone. When she reached Farron Whitcroft's marker, she paused longer, unpinning her Navy cross from inside her coat and placing it gently at the base of the stone. Mission complete, she whispered. As she rose and turned to leave, she was surprised to find a gathering of service members standing at a distance, men and women in various uniforms, forming a loose semicircle behind her. Some she recognized from her former teams, others were strangers to her, yet all shared the same expression of solemn respect. When she passed through their ranks, each one rendered a perfect salute. 6 months later, the campus of Annapolis Naval Academy was bathed in spring sunshine as midshipmen hurried between classes. In a large lecture hall, Zaria stood before a class of future officers, her presentation on ethical leadership drawing to a close. The most important decisions you'll make won't be in combat, she told them. They'll be in quiet rooms, in ordinary moments, when no one is watching and the only witness to your integrity is your own conscience. A young woman in the front row raised her hand. Commander, given everything that happened with the Whitcroft case, do you still believe in the system? I believe in people who are willing to fix broken systems, Zaria replied. That's what leadership is, not just following orders or giving them, but having the courage to challenge them when they're wrong. After the lecture, as students filed out, Zaria noticed Ensign Rivera waiting by the door. Commander, Rivera greeted her with a sharp salute. Thank you for coming to speak. At ease, Ensign. How's your first year as an instructor? Challenging, Rivera admitted, but good. I'm teaching tactical communications now, with a heavy emphasis on equipment testing and verification. Zaria smiled. Farron would approve. As they walked across the campus grounds, Rivera gestured toward a new building under construction. They're naming it after your team, the Kingfisher Center for Ethical Leadership. The midshipmen already call it the Blackwood Building, though. As long as they remember why it matters, Zaria replied. That evening, as sunset painted the Chesapeake Bay in shades of gold and crimson, Zaria stood on the seawall overlooking the water. The weight of the past 18 months, from the disastrous operation to the courtroom humiliation to the legislative victory, seemed to settle around her shoulders like a familiar rucksack. A familiar voice broke her reverie. "Penny for your thoughts, Commander?" She turned to find Admiral Harrington approaching along the path, now in civilian clothes, his military bearing unchanged by retirement. "Just wondering what comes next, sir." "That's entirely up to you," he replied. "The Oversight Division is running smoothly. The Blackwood Act is changing procurement practices across all branches. You've accomplished what you set out to do." "Not all of it," she said quietly. "Ah." Harrington nodded in understanding. "You're thinking about the field again." "Every day," she admitted. "I'm grateful for what we've achieved, but I'm an operator at heart. Always will be." Harrington gazed out over the water. "I received an interesting call from the Director of Naval Intelligence yesterday. Seems they're forming a new special task force. Very selective, highly classified. They need a commander with unimpeachable integrity and field experience." "Are you offering me a job, sir?" "Merely passing along information," he replied with the ghost of a smile, though I did mention I knew someone who might be interested. As night fell over Annapolis, Zaria made her decision. The fight for accountability would continue, but so would her service in the field. There were still missions that needed completing, still operators who needed a commander they could trust with their lives. The next morning, Commander Zaria Blackwood reported for her new assignment, carrying with her the memory of 4 fallen team members, the legacy of systemic change, and the unwavering conviction that had carried her from the battlefield to the courtroom and back again. In a quiet ceremony witnessed only by Admiral Harrington and a handful of senior officers, Zaria received her new orders and team roster. As she studied the faces of the operators who would serve under her command, she silently renewed the promise she had made at Arlington months earlier. This time, the system wouldn't fail them. This time, every piece of equipment, every tactical plan, every decision would be scrutinized with the knowledge paid for by the lives of her former team. This time, they would all come home. "Team," she addressed them for the first time, "our mission begins tomorrow. Tonight I want each of you to remember why we serve, who we protect, and what it means to wear the uniform. The privilege comes with responsibility, to each other, to this country, and to those who can't fight for themselves." After dismissing her new team, Zaria remained in the briefing room reviewing dossiers and operational plans. A small silver compass rested beside her notes. Chief Aksoy's talisman, now hers to carry forward. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Someone whose quiet strength changed systems, saved lives, or stood firm when others would have broken? Share your story in the comments below and subscribe to hear more accounts of unsung heroes finally receiving the justice they deserve.